Hello everyone, it is now 8 p.m. and on the East Coast at least, and so we are going to begin the webinar. We're expecting a few more people, but hopefully they will join us soon. But want to start this time, as we start all of our reconciling process, in an attitude of prayer, as this is a spiritual journey that we're embarking on together for the next 90 minutes. So if you will join your heart with mine in prayer. God of many names and ways which we can cradle yet never contain, thankful for the time that we have here together on the phone and on the computer, and the time that we get to have in person to experience you and our sisters and brothers. Thankful for this technology which enables us to connect across the United Methodist Connection, and for the time that we will have beyond tonight to continue to connect to build your kingdom here on this earth. We pray over the technology that all goes well, and are thankful for all of the passion and experience and energy that is brought to us through the computer. All of this we pray in your child's name. Amen. So I do want to thank you for joining us and welcome you to the first of the Reconciling Process webinar series. We will be focusing tonight on self-interest and the assessment tool. But before we get started, wanted you to be able to at least see some of the voices that you will be hearing tonight over the phone. So my name is Rachel Harvey. I am over here on your left. I am a deaconess and serve as the Associate Executive Director of the Reconciling Ministries Network. And here to my right, to your right, is Audrey Krumbach, and she is the national organizer for the Reconciling Ministries Network. And we together form the outreach staff of RMN. And in general, the outreach staff, we work to live out RMN's mission, which is to mobilize United Methodists of all sexual orientations and gender identities to transform our church and world into the full expression of Christ's inclusive love. And so we do that through connecting with churches and campus ministry, communities like Sunday school classes, and other gatherings of Reconciling United Methodists who go through this reconciling process to craft a statement that explicitly names that gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people, or people of all sexual orientations and gender identities, are welcome and included in their churches. And then beyond writing that statement, then we work with those same groups and others to live out that statement of welcome in their communities, across the United Methodist Connection, and in the United States. So in general, our work takes place over the phone and through email, as we've connected with many of you, but sometimes it even gets to take place in person. But tonight we're very glad that you're here with us. Audrey, would you mind going ahead and just introducing yourself to the group?
I'll be glad to. Thank you, Rachel. Again, my name is Audrey. As Rachel has already said, I'm a national organizer with Reconciling. And I consider myself incredibly blessed to work with Reconciling Ministries because my call is to not just encourage the oppressed, but to help create a church that is not as sexist as the one that I grew up in, and a church where every voice is welcome, regardless of gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, any other category. And so for me, this is just really exciting work because I get to live every day into the church that I hope we will someday become.
Thank you. And again, I'm Rachel Harvey. I am a deaconess, which means I'm a lay person, appointed to serve as the Associate Executive Director of the Reconciling Ministries Network. And I grew up in eastern Pennsylvania in Amish and Mennonite community. And I am here and do this work because I love my family, and my family includes my lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender friends, and also a niece and a nephew who are both under 5. And currently only God knows who they'll become, but I do this work so that when they become who they will be, that all of their love will be celebrated, welcomed, and embraced in the United Methodist Church, which is our home family. So just a quick overview of what we're going to cover in the next 80 or so minutes by now. But we will do an overview of the process webinar series, so naming what's coming up and ways to connect. Also an overview of the webinar technology, so the ways in which you can interact through the next 80 minutes. Then we'll move into a discussion of self-interest. So what is self-interest? Why is it important? And then we'll all have an opportunity to name our self-interest together on the webinar. And then after we talk about our self-interest, then we'll move into a time of looking at the assessment tool, which you can do offline with the teams within your prospective reconciling communities. And then after that, we'll have a time for questions and responses from Audrey and I. And so those questions can relate to self-interest in the assessment tool, as well as general questions about the reconciling process that you might have. And then we will close our time together with an announcement of the next portion of the process webinar series. So an overview of the process webinar series. This is our first one today, so we'll be able to check this off in the next hour or so. And we are starting with self-interest in the assessment tool. And then on May 1st, you'll see that all of these webinars take place on Sunday evenings, and they will always be at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So the next one is on May 1st, and that one will focus on positive messages and framing questions for our reconciling processes moving forward. After that, on July 10th, we will explore common barriers as well as conflict management techniques that have worked in different reconciling processes. After that, we will, on August 7th, go through Bible 101, so looking at both some of the texts of terror as well as the texts of promise that might come up in some of your reconciling conversations. And then on September 18th, we will talk about good resources and how we can use them well within our communities. And then either on October 9th or the 23rd, we will talk about crafting welcoming statements and how to take a vote peacefully. And that date will be finalized in July, so we will be sure to let all of you know about that. And so while this is our series for the next 6 months, certainly we weren't able to fit all of the reconciling process into these 90-minute webinars. So do want to remind you that Audrey and I are always available to talk over the phone, in person if we're able to get to where you live, or through email to work with you, breathe with you through your reconciling process. And just want to note that the reconciling process is a spiritual opportunity for your community. It's an opportunity for all communities to grow in membership and stewardship and vitality. And as such, it should always be presented within the context of your faith community. And so the reconciling process is really more an art than it is a science. So we'll be presenting what has worked in some other communities. On future webinars, we will have voices from some experts out in the field, as well as some people who have gone through this experience within their local church. Audrey and I have been privileged to walk alongside many different communities along the reconciling journey, but we also want to use this webinar series as an opportunity to bring to the surface some of those other voices who have their own personal experiences to share. And so we'll begin tonight with an assessment because the assessment of your congregation, of its culture and personality, theological roots, and the historical pace of different welcomes that you have extended to different communities is really critical in this work that we're going to do through the reconciling process. Also want to note that if you miss a session, we are recording this webinar, and we'll record all webinars. And those will be available a week after each webinar through the process page on the RMN website. If you have any questions about that, again, just contact Audrey or myself.
We want to spend just a few minutes now sharing with you about this technology and the excitement of what it means to see the screen, but then also to hear one another. As you may have noticed, everyone except the presenters are currently muted. We do that not to stifle conversation because it drastically improves the quality of sound. And in fact, I don't know if you can see this, but I even mute myself whenever Rachel is speaking because I'm in a louder room. So again, if you want to speak, it's very easy. We'll show you how to do that in just one moment. So the screen you see in front of you is simply meant to show you what you are seeing and just to acknowledge that you should be seeing in this area here. Rachel, do I have your keyboard? There we go. Thank you. So in this area here, this is to represent the GoToWebinar panel, so that this is where you will be seeing what is on Rachel's screen. Because I am at a distance, I have exactly the same panel, and Rachel just has a larger one. So we're seeing everything that's open on her computer right now. And then outside of that, this tree picture is only meant to represent whatever your background is. And then this is the GoToWebinar panel that has some instructions. And so we're going to talk about some of the things that that panel allows you to do. One of them is that this orange button allows you to open and close your instruction panel. So for example, if this area on your screen is covering up part of the screen and you want to see all of it, you can simply press that orange button and it closes the information panel. You can hit it again and it will open it again. If you choose this view menu, you can always set the control panel to auto hide this area or not to auto hide if you prefer to always keep it open so you can type questions, enter the chat, or watch your controls and instructions. Next we have the audio panel that's here. And this is to just help you understand what's going on. By default, you're using the microphone and speakers. That is this option here. You will see that you are muted here. When the organizer unmutes you, that will go green. And this is simply to show you how much volume you are hearing. You can click the audio setup blue button here if your microphone is not working correctly, and that will actually take you to your computer's information about your speaker and your headset to fix all your sound control. If you prefer, you can also join by selecting use telephone and call in. Dial-in information will be displayed, including an audio pin. If you would like to ask any questions of the presenters, you must enter your audio pin in order for us to unmute your line. Otherwise, you will not be able to speak. You will only be able to hear over the telephone. So again, that's what this button is all about. During the whole presentation, you have the opportunity to type questions to Rachel and myself. During the sections where Rachel is presenting, I will be monitoring this question panel, so feel free to ask a question about the webinar itself or about what Rachel is covering at that moment. But of course, at the end of the presentation, we're going to do questions and answers, and Rachel will be having opportunities throughout questions and answers to answer all your questions. There we go. Next, you have the raise your hand button. It's on the small section here. You'll see this button right here. Looks like a hand with this. To raise your hand, you just click on that button. If everyone will please raise their hand at this moment. If you have found this button on your screen, please raise your hand. Excellent. I see 2 folks who have been able to raise their hand. We're still waiting for a few folks to raise their hands. Again, if you will please just raise your hand. Don't take it down. Just leave the hand up. Raise your hands. All right, good job. I have Jan and John and Judy Hornaday have raised their hands, but I'm still waiting for 3 more folks. As we go through the presentation, if at any point you will, as you will see, those of you who had your hand raised, we can actually lower the hands as organizers as well. As we go through the presentation, if at any point we are moving too quickly, if you will please raise your hand. As well, if you are having problems with the audio and you cannot hear Rachel clearly, please raise your hand and type it into the question box if you cannot hear. You can type something as simple as can't hear or too soft, and we will stop and adjust our controls for volume. And again, Rachel already said this, questions and answers will be answered at the end of today's section, and everyone will receive an email within 7 days. We weren't able to edit the slide because it comes from the GoToWebinar people. Within 7 days with the link to review the recorded version of today's session. And that will be recorded so that you can play it from any computer that has Windows Media, QuickTime, Real Player, iTunes. If your computer can play videos, you'll be able to see this. Are there any questions at this time about the technology itself? If there are, if you'll go ahead and either type those in or raise your hand, we will answer those questions and make sure that we are all ready to be in conversation today. All right, thank you, Rachel.
Great, and we're going to take an opportunity now to hear where people are from, and the way that we're going to do that is through a poll. So the first question is, what type of community are you engaging in the reconciling process through? And so if you'll go ahead and click on the answer that is correct for you, church, campus ministry, class at church, for example, a Sunday school class, or other. We're waiting just for a few more people to take the poll. Okay, 100% of the people have voted. Audrey, can you tell me, are the poll results showing?
Yes, we're seeing the poll results.
Okay, I cannot see them on my screen. So would you mind
Absolutely
sharing what they?
Yeah, everyone is coming from a church. We are 100% church tonight, and no representation from campus ministries or a class at church or other.
Okay, well, great. That should make our question and answer time very interesting for everyone here on the call. And we're going to do just one more poll. You did a great job with that first one. And the second poll is, what jurisdiction is your, well, church for everyone on this call located in? So if you'll go ahead and vote for your jurisdiction that you are located in. Okay, everyone has voted. So it looks like we have each jurisdiction represented other than the Northeast jurisdiction. But we do seem to be, we have a couple more people in the Western jurisdiction, and so in a couple minutes we'll be able to hear where each person is from when we share a sentence of what our self-interest is. But do want to thank you all for participating in both the poll and the webinar. So we are here tonight to talk about self-interest, and a definition of self-interest is that self-interest generally refers to a focus on the needs or desires or interests of oneself. And oftentimes we as generally as people of faith, oftentimes as those who connect their lives with another, who stand in solidarity with people, find this definition challenging. And so Saul Alinsky defined self-interest differently and said that self-interest is not the same thing as selfishness, and that the word is not motivated by altruism, but when self-interest is aligned with an organization's interest or public interest, it is a relational concept and makes organizations and campaigns significantly more sustainable. And so when we talk about self-interest, we're not talking about either selfishness or selflessness, but grounding and naming who we are and why we are engaged in this work. So oftentimes, persons who are ordained or commissioned will have a call story. But so in this work, it'll be important for all of us to really dig in and excavate our own call stories for why we are called to be Reconciling United Methodists, why we're called to engage in this process of the reconciling process in our local churches. So you might be wondering, well then why are we talking about self-interest? But people are motivated by their own self-interest. And so we connect with others who are passionate about full inclusion by connecting our self-interest to their self-interest. And knowing our own self-interest enables us to create relationships and sustain our activism. I'm sure that you know some people who have been burned out in this work, or who have found that you might know people who got involved in the work and then something else came up, and so they moved on to another justice issue or onto another community. But without an understanding of who we are and what we believe, it's impossible to create relationships with others, and especially relationships that are sustained and make it through rough times. And without a deep understanding of what motivates us, it becomes much easier to walk away or to be burned out when the challenge of working with an institution, within an institution, beyond an institution all come into play. And if you've participated in RMN's Called to Witness campaign, you might recognize that a lot of self-interest is mirrored through our stories of self. And those stories of self are the stories that answer why we're called to do what it is that we are called to do, or what it is that grounds us in this work. And so I wanted to share some writing by Victoria Shafford, and this piece comes through The Small Work in the Great Work, which is an essay that is written in a book called The Impossible Will Take a Little While. And so this work comes as she's sharing about a friend who works a lot with students on a campus. And so she says, I have a friend who traffics in words. She is not a minister, but a psychiatrist in the health clinic at a prestigious women's college. We were sitting once not long after a student she had known and counseled committed suicide in the dormitory there. My friend, the doctor, the healer, held the loss very closely in those first few days, not unprofessionally, but deeply, fully, as you or I would have, had this been someone in our care. At one point, with tears streaming down her face, she looked up in defiance, this is the only word for it, and spoke explicitly of her vocation, as if out of the ashes of that day she were renewing a vow or making a new covenant, and I think she was. She spoke explicitly of her vocation and of yours and mine. She said, you know, I can't save them. I am not here to save anybody or to save the world. All I can do, what I am called to do, is to plant myself at the gates of hope. Sometimes they come in, sometimes they walk by, but I stand there every day and I call out until my lungs are sore with calling, and I beckon and urge them in towards beautiful life and love. By grace, by her will, she is planted at the gates of hope regardless. There's something for all of us there. I think whatever our vocation, we stand beckoning and calling, singing and shouting, planted at the gates of hope. This world and our people are beautiful and broken, and we are called to raise that up to bear witness to the possibility of living with the dignity, bravery, and gladness that benefits a human being. That may be what it is to live out our mission. And so as you've heard, her calling, her self-interest, what grounds her in this work is planting herself at this gate of hope, as she names it. And so we want to give you a few minutes, 5 minutes, to take some time, if you have a pen and paper nearby, to write it down, but to but to see if you can, in one sentence, answer one of the following questions to name your self-interest tonight on the webinar. So the questions we'll explore are, why are you called to be a Reconciling United Methodist? Or, why are you planted at the gates of hope? So in the beginning, Audrey and I both shared our sentence that describes why we do this work that we do, what we're planted at the gates of hope for, who we call out to, and what we scream and sing. So as I play a song, I want to invite you to write your one sentence that describes why you're called to be a Reconciling United Methodist, or why you're planted at the gates of hope. So now we have an opportunity to share our self-interest. And so I'm just going to call on each person in the webinar, and Audrey will unmute you. And so if you will share your name, the name of the community that you're representing, and where you're located, so your state, and then share your one-sentence answer to either the question of why are you called to be a Reconciling United Methodist, or why are you planted at the gates of hope. So Babs, will you begin us off? Babs, you are currently unmuted. Babs, if you're having technical difficulties, why don't you just type a question into the question box, and Audrey will see if she can work it out.
Rachel, why don't you go on to the next person?
Sure. Jan McDonald. Let's see if we're able to hear you. You are currently unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Oh, very good. Okay, here's our sentence. I'm with two other people from my church.
Great.
Our sentence is, we are called to be Reconciling United Methodists because it is the just thing to do, to be the loving, accepting people Christ called us to be.
Wonderful. And what is the name of your church, and where are you located?
We are Union United Methodist Church, and we are located in St. Louis, Missouri.
Wonderful. It's great to have you here. Thank you. And John, will you share next? John, you are unmuted now. So
Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Okay, I'm from Kirkwood United Methodist in St. Louis as well. And I guess my sentence is, growing up in the Methodist Church and learning what I learned, I am called to be a Reconciling United Methodist.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And Judy Jacoby. Judy, are you able to speak through maybe your microphone or cell phone? Okay, Judy, if you are sharing, we're unable to hear you. So if you'll type a question into the question box, Audrey will be able to help you share with us on the webinar. Let's try Judy Hornaday.
Judy, you are unmuted.
So you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I think one of the problems in getting Babs to respond earlier because I had the same one, was not seeing how I could type in a question, and she does not have a mic.
Oh, okay.
I can now see when I fully expanded your screen that now I've got controls in the upper right-hand corner, but those weren't visible until I maximized the screen.
Okay.
My statement, first, I'm from Newman United Methodist Church in Grants Pass, Oregon, and Babs is also. We both serve on the Reconciling Congregation Committee, and she's the chair.
Wonderful.
My statement is that since childhood, I've been called to help the downtrodden, beginning with blacks and expanding as my education and exposure to life grew. And so it now includes reaching out to gays and lesbians, and I happen to be one.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing. And Lene, you are currently unmuted. Lene, do you have either your cell phone or a mic to share your self-interest? Okay, and if there is anyone who was not able to share, if you will raise your hand, then
Rachel?
Audrey, yes?
I have a response from Babs. She shared it with me via chat.
Great.
Yes. And Babs says that her self-interest is to provide a place church where all can feel welcomed and loved. If not me, then who?
Wonderful. Thank you very much for finding creative ways to share when our audio sources are not working. And so if anyone else who was not able to share by speaking through the webinar would like to share your statement of self-interest, just go ahead and type that into the question or chat, and Audrey will see that and will share it with us on the line. We're going to move now into a time of looking at the assessment tool. But before we do that, I wanted to note that community organizing is bringing people together to act out of their own self-interest, to live out the values and vision that is in the best self-interest of their collective community. And so even before we began our conversation of what is self-interest, you all came here tonight because your values and vision, either that you currently have or are seeking to live into as a faith community, in some way mirror the mission and values of the Reconciling Ministries Network. So do want to thank you for sharing your self-interest and for the passion that you bring into this work that we do together as a community. So now we're going to look at the assessment tool, which, if you're not aware, is available through the Reconciling Ministries Network's website. So if you go to the home page and then you click on Learn More, and then again click on the Reconciling process, at the bottom of the page there's a download for the assessment tool. It is also available through the Institute for Welcoming Resources, which is the website which is currently up on the screen. So that website is www.welcomingresources.org/welcomingtoolkit.pdf. And this assessment tool that we're going to look at in a few minutes is just one portion of the entire toolkit that the Institute for Welcoming Resources has put together on the welcoming or open and affirming process. So the Institute for Welcoming Resources is an ecumenical movement for pro-gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender inclusion across our denominations. And so they have put together this toolkit that talks about self-interest. It talks about the assessment, how we make an assessment of where our congregation currently might stand in relation to full inclusion of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people. Also has really great resources around conflict management and many of the other topics that we're going to talk through as we move through this Reconciling Process webinar series. So certainly wanted to make sure that you are aware of this as a resource. And so we're going to go right now to this website through the miracle of technology. So when you enter the link into your browser, you will come into the site 15 pages ahead of where we currently are. But if you do come to this 15th page, that's where the congregational assessment begins. And while it says congregational assessment, this assessment can be used in a campus ministry, it can be used in a Sunday school class, and it can be used in a United Methodist Women's Unit. So while it says congregation, it's not necessarily tied to that. And sadly, we do not have time tonight on the call to have each of you go through and score your congregation in our case on this call, but do encourage you to download the resource. If you're not able to download it and print it out, please do contact us in the RMN office, and we would be glad to make as many copies as you need and mail them to you. But you'll see as we move through that it has different questions and then asks you to rank your congregation's answer and then record the score over here to the side. So for example, some of the questions are, does your congregation already have a mission statement which explicitly includes people of all sexual orientations and gender identities? Some other questions as we move through, does your congregation welcome and include a diverse population? Are you aware of LGBT persons in your congregation? Has your congregation already done or participated in blessings of same-sex relationships? So you can see that the questions really vary. And does your congregation have an openly lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender pastor? This is one place where you can see that the assessment is used beyond the United Methodist Church, as currently our policy does not allow people to serve openly in all of our annual conferences. Is the lay leadership of your congregation predominantly male or female? And there you would choose a ranking between 1 to 5. And so you can see that there are many questions, so when you're going through this either on your own, or we definitely recommend, if you have a reconciling committee at your local church, that you print out the assessment and the scoring sheet and invite each person to take the assessment for your congregation and then to compare your scores at the end. So some other questions. Have the youth of your congregation expressed an opinion on becoming welcoming? And then if no youth, select number 3, the size and type of your church. And so once you've gone through these 25 questions, then you will total up your score. And then the final total of your score will reveal a suggested curriculum that might work in your community. And that curriculum will be available on the next couple slides. But again, I want to remind you that the reconciling process is not a science, but it is an art. And so while these are suggestions for what the process might look like in your community, it certainly is dependent upon your local culture. And when you do this congregational assessment in your group at your church, this sheet is very helpful for tallying up each person's score so that you can see them side by side. And in the toolkit, it has some really helpful discussion questions for the facilitation of the discussion of the assessment. So some of those questions are, like if there were places where the scoring was drastically different, or when someone had a question and they weren't sure how to answer, then you could look more at that question and then have a conversation about the tradition of your community, the history of your community, and what caused each person to answer differently. As I mentioned, the final score that you have from the average of the people who take the assessment will reveal a suggested process outline. And so this process is either from Saint Adventurous to Saint Moderate or Saint Cautious. And all of this, again, depends on the ranking that you and other members of your reconciling community, you could ask your pastor to take it, that all of you have collectively. And so the process really begins with the lead of the process. So having that core team or your reconciling committee come together, conduct some one-to-one meetings, so sitting down and hearing from people about where your congregation is, taking this quiz, and then gathering information, so examining your congregation's history, a power analysis, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes, as well as the culture, so that you can better understand how your congregation has moved through change and conflict in the past. And then choosing the right frame, which will come up in our next webinar series. So that's deciding a frame that resonates within your community, so the language that we use to talk about both reconciling as well as just to have conversations. So what is the lens that your community is able to see this work through? And then after you talk about what lens would be appropriate in your community, you want to outline your process. So outlining what steps you will take along your reconciling journey. They have it listed as step 5, but really along the whole way of our reconciling process, we're building relationships. So talking with the clergy, the formal and informal leadership of the church, the people who people go to ask their opinion, maybe the matriarch or the patriarch of your church, people who sit on the church council, for example, and certainly always your pastor and lay leaders are very important people to always be building relationships with, but especially through the reconciling process. The next step would be making it official. So in some congregation that means going to the church council to make your group an official reconciling committee to study the process and to begin to bring the process and continually bring it before the church council. It might mean going and having a meeting again with the pastor to say that we are officially moving forward in the process. And then after that, then you set the frame. So you've already explored what frames will resonate within your faith community, but then introducing that frame to the congregation. So it might be through a mission moment, through education or other service projects. And then you continue on by providing education within your faith community, and the webinar around resources and using them well will be very helpful for the different ways in which we can provide educational opportunities around a fully inclusive welcome in our local communities. Step 9 is really also step 1, which is ensuring that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people are at the table so that they're directly involved in all parts of your reconciling process. And then step 10 is to write your welcoming statement. And we will talk more about this in October on our webinar, but there are samples of welcoming statements on the RMN website under the process page. The next step is taking a straw poll. So having an anonymous online survey for the congregation, but a straw poll really enables you as a reconciling committee to get a feel for where the congregation is before you actually take your vote. And then step 12, holding a congregational vote, and that should take place in the same ways that your community makes other decisions. So that could be a congregational vote or a church council vote. Then you celebrate and publicize your reconciling statement. So many churches keep that on the bulletin. Some of them put it outside on a banner, but just always reminding people of your welcome, and then continuing to live out that welcome fully within your community. So that is the assessment that is available online. And as I mentioned, the assessment tool and the toolkit available on welcomingresources.org does outline some suggestions for talking about the ways in which your community handles both change and conflict. And we will be talking about conflict management in one of our webinar series. But just want to note that conflict is a part of the catalyst for change. And so conflict is a part of all of our faith communities. And if your congregation is conflict avoidant, any old issues that you have or haven't dealt with within your community are going to come up through your reconciling process. And that isn't to scare you, but to say that as we move through this process with an openness to change, know that people will see you and the reconciling community as a safe place to begin to embrace and discuss change, and that oftentimes if there's conflict in your community, if there was a lot of conflict over the changing of the color of the carpet, or if conflict came up when your pastor changed or there was shifting demographics in your community, just be aware of the different sources of conflict that there might have been in your local congregation. And so it's really helpful if you're new to your congregation that your reconciling team or those one-to-one conversations that you've had with different people in the congregation include some people who have been there for a while, who are able to talk to the tradition of change and the history of conflict that has happened in your local community. It's important that we not run away from conflict, but name and claim it as a part of our process. And this is just a part of the process of being a family, is learning to engage and deal with conflict. And what we fear is not conflict, but oftentimes the bad behaviors that come along with conflict. But if we can model for our communities positive ways to deal with and move through conflict as a healthy form of community and conversation, then that will greatly help our process. And in addition to looking at change and conflict, it's also important to look at who holds power in your community. So how does your community make important decisions? And who are the opinion leaders? And so that would definitely include your lay leaders, but it also includes the matriarchs in your church, the patriarchs in your church. Those people that are typically gone to and sought out, where their opinion is sought out. And it's definitely always important that that you do connect with your pastor or campus minister or the leader of your Sunday school class to find out what they think about the full inclusion of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. If your pastor or campus minister or leader is openly against the reconciling process, it's not impossible, but it will be difficult to move forward. So they won't be a stumbling block, but you will have to engage them as well as engaging other leaders in the community, and it could be more difficult as you move forward. So that is sort of the full picture of self-assessment and self-interest, and the assessment tool. But we wanted to leave plenty of time at the end for any questions that you have. And so we'll start out first with questions about self-interest or the assessment tool. And so if you do have a question, if you will raise your hand or type your question into the question box, then Audrey will be able to share questions that are typed into the question box. And if you raise your hand, then we will unmute you so that you can speak to the group. So it looks like Babs has a question. Babs, would you like to speak your question or type it into the box?
Rachel, as we move into question times and as Bab works with her microphone, I did also want to name that we heard from Judy Jacoby about her self-interest. And so I know we're going back a little, but I wanted to acknowledge that she had typed it in and share that with everyone, if that's all right.
Yeah, that would be great.
Thanks. Judy says that she wants the UMC to be a congregation and denomination of truly open minds and open doors.
Thank you, Judy.
Babs, if you'd like to simply type your question into the same box where you typed your self-interest earlier, we will be glad to read that out loud.
So as Babs is typing her question, does anyone else have a question related to self-interest or the assessment tool? Has anyone already used the assessment tool in your local community? If you have, will you raise your hand?
Babs reports that she used the self-assessment several years ago, but were unable to move beyond it. I see that now the framing has a bit more of a tool than that they may be able to use.
Oh, great. Well, seeing no other questions, let's move on to just opening it up for any questions that you have about the reconciling process. And so if you have a question, I'll ask you to raise your hand or type it into the question box. Looks like John has a question, so you are now unmuted.
Okay, Mike, I don't know if this is a question or what, but, you know, I think I've gone through that questionnaire several years ago, and just thinking over some of the questions, you know, we should be on the Saint, whatever the most liberal one is. We had at the last general conference, our pastor asked about this issue and did a straw poll for us. And the straw poll showed 85% of the people think that we need to change what's in the discipline. And yet, our pastor does not want to rock the boat. He doesn't want to raise this issue. We did a sermon series on why Christians are unchristian. And we talked, and our associate pastor, a woman, gave a wonderful sermon about why we shouldn't be homophobic. And yet she said, we're not going to become a reconciling congregation. Where do we go from here? That's my question.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like there was 85% in 2008 of the congregation who did not agree with what is currently written in the Book of Discipline. But your lead pastor, your senior pastor, was not willing to move forward with the reconciling process?
That's right.
and your associate pastor is supportive, but silently supportive. Well, not silently if she gave a sermon.
Right. She's supportive of the concept. She's just not supportive of the process.
Hmm. And has there been study in your community outside of the sermon series?
Very little.
Okay. Well, it seems like offering.
Well, let me point out another thing. Well, of course, that's your assessment tool. We have a lesbian couple who our minister has accepted into the church, has baptized their child, all these things, but it's all on the down low.
Mm-hmm. I think having some church-wide forums. So oftentimes movies are a great space for that, as well as some studies, so that your pastor can see that it's really a movement of the community and of the congregation. I mean, if that wasn't clear after an 85% straw poll, perhaps having congregational discussions where the pastor hears that this is a movement of the community might help to move your pastor forward. Have you sat down and talked with the senior pastor about why he is not in favor of you moving forward in the process?
I don't think he's being honest. I think, or straightforward. I think it's because there are people who are big contributors who are not accepting of the concept of being reconciling.
Mm-hmm.
But it's only something that I have as a feeling. I don't have any proof of it.
Right. Yeah, I think I would suggest having a conversation with the pastor, and whether that's you who's able to have the conversation or another member of your reconciling team, or if you go as a group of people to have the conversation to find out what the roadblocks really are, so that you can begin to build relationships with those persons who the pastor might be afraid of losing, so that you can sort of demystify, like, are they really anti-reconciling or not? And then you can have an assessment of where power does lie within your community, with an acknowledgement that power lies in each person, and that we never know who might join our community because we become reconciling. Oftentimes in our communities we can see who might leave, though we never know who will stay and who will go, or the reasons that they go. Sometimes people leave because the carpet really is changed and they can't deal with it. But it is a reality that sometimes people do leave our communities, both because of the reconciling process and because of other unnamed I wish that I had an easy answer.
Excuse me?
I said I wish that I had an easy answer, but
Otherwise.
yeah. So if either of us finds it, we'll let everyone else know. But until then, we'll continue to move through this as families do. Thanks for your question, John.
Rachel, I'd like to share with everyone some comments from Babs that have been very helpful and interesting, and some questions that she's brought up. As I mentioned earlier, she said that they used the self-assessment several years ago, but were unable to move beyond it. She shared that also part of the inability to use the assessment was that they jumped into the reconciling process with both feet, and they had already used some of the suggested tools, and their process has been very slow and frustrating. Quote, "We have old people who are unwilling to change. One of the arguments is that people will leave our church. In fact, big supporters. They won't listen to the success stories of other churches, and it is a rather conservative community. Even though their church is the most accepting church in the community, the old folks are still rebelling from becoming a reconciling congregation.
So it seems like there is a resonance around losing funders within our communities. And I think that that especially resonates for many congregations where there's this overarching fear across the United Methodist Church that the church is dying and that we are losing our membership here in the U.S. But as Babs pointed out, we do have many of our reconciling congregations who are growing and thriving, and so growing in numbers-wise, growing in their annual budgets, as well as growing deeply as spiritual faith communities. And so I hear you, Babs, when you say that you have shared case studies of what has worked in other congregations, and that you've continued to try and build relationships. So I would just suggest that you try to continue to build those relationships and have people share their stories, and as many stories as you can share of out gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people, of people who are straight allies. We really do believe in RMN that it is stories and relationships that change people's hearts and minds, but it's not quick or easy work that takes place. Audrey, do you have any suggestions for this particular question?
I think what is often striking in our conservative communities when we speak of the fear of people who are leaving is that it often silences us because we are interested in literally, you know, it's a cheesy thing to say, but we are interested in reconciling and we don't want people to leave.
Mm-hmm.
So for some communities, one of the most helpful things can be helping draw a picture around the pain that is being done by not being more welcoming. And sometimes it can be as explicit as sharing specific stories of people who have been hurt by the United Methodist stand. And sometimes it can be more subtle and just having people talk about the pain of being excluded in any way in their life. But I know there are several communities that have worked on personal storytelling as a model towards helping people express those stories and find those stories, and others that have used film series. Movies like For the Bible Tells Me So actually make very personal the question of how does it feel when people reject or accept you for your orientation or identity.
Thank you for sharing. Are there any other questions about the reconciling process? Or does anyone have a comment or response to any of the questions that we heard? Looks like we have one question that's coming in. And so I'll just remind everyone that if you do have a comment or response to a question that's shared, if you'll raise your hand, then Audrey or I will be able to unmute you. Audrey and I are staff with RMN, but much of the wisdom from the Reconciling movement comes from our entire collective wisdom that we share together as a movement. So if you do have a comment or response to someone's question, Audrey and I are here to share, but we are not the only experts on the call. So it looks like we have a question coming in from Judy. Audrey, was there a question typed in?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I actually answered it so that all could see it, but I'll be glad to read that.
Okay.
Judy shared a little bit more about what Babs had shared in their church. They've actually spent 2 years presenting a series of seminars, discussions, panels, videos, etc., and they've preached to the choir. Those who are opposed have attended one meeting at best. Their minds are simply closed. At this point, some of the committee members are hesitant to proceed because of the possible conflict in knowledge that they've already lost some members due to even the presence of the process itself. At the same time, though, they have received new gay attendees, and last Sunday they voted and passed the Shampooey Agreement. And for those of us who don't know, that declaration was a powerful statement for full inclusion.
I think one of the things that Judy highlighted in the comments that were shared is that oftentimes people who are opposed to the reconciling process, or even people who are unsure about the reconciling process, might not actually come to the studies that we offer or the film screenings. And that's not to say that those avenues for education are not effective, but that as with all recruitment that we do, it's important that we go to people in their own space. So as much as you can try to link and find some inroads within other communities in your churches, so going to the United Methodist Women's Unit meeting and asking if you can hold a discussion as one of their topics for their meeting, or going to United Methodist Men, meeting with the youth group, meeting with the group of Sunday school teachers to talk about what is the reconciling process and answer any questions that they might have. So as many different groupings of people that you can find within your church and go to them, as well as offering up opportunities for people to come to you, we found has been really helpful in many different communities where people are not willing to actually come to a film screening. So going to them is always helpful. It looks like Judy is sharing either a response or another question. So we'll need to hear what that is, and Audrey will share that with us.
Judy reports that they were very gratified by the passage, but troubled by the fact that many of the generally opposed old guard did not attend, even though it was a called all-church meeting when the vote was held. You know, Judy, Sue Laurie, who actually held my job before I did, used to tell a story about visiting a church in Upper New York, and they had invited her to come while they were voting to become reconciling. And about 6 people out of this congregation of 200 showed up to say, how could we ever make any change? This is terrible. I mean, they showed up, right? Like, that's a good sign. And an old man back in the corner, probably the oldest person in the room, very quiet, had not participated actively in church leadership, but was always at the meetings, spoke up and said, but we need to grow as a church. And so everybody started arguing for about 20 minutes about growth as a church and how they didn't understand why they weren't growing, and they were a great church, and how could they not grow? And at this point, the old man spoke up again, and Sue realized that he had set them up, because he said, but you all voted not to grow. We asked ourselves 3 years ago if we wanted to hire an evangelist and actually develop a second sermon and reach out to the neighborhoods, and you all voted that you'd rather continue having whatever program instead of this. And Sue always said that this was a great story because it revealed to her that in even the best churches where someone can speak the truth, sometimes the truth can't be heard. Because he named the fact that they had not wanted to change, and nothing happened. They continued to fight, and it was as if he had never said that. And so I shared this story, which probably doesn't sound very encouraging at first, to remind you that sometimes we actually can't change hearts and minds, And sometimes it's our prayers and our consistent relationships and building the one-to-ones with people just over sometimes many, many years that can bring us to change. Actually, that church is now reconciling today. It took them about 4 years after that crazy church council meeting.
Thanks for sharing that, Audrey. Are there any other questions or responses that people have? But I'm not seeing any. So do want to remind you that the next webinar series is on Sunday, May 1st at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 7 Central, 6 Mountain, and 5 Pacific. And on that call, we will be talking about positive messages and framing. Audrey, do you want to say a little bit about what positive messages and framing means?
Absolutely. Our next webinar is specifically around, uber simplified. The most simple way to say it is, what can we put on our posters? What can we put in our bulletin announcements that help people be curious about it? But this is also about how do we frame our questions? How do we literally ask questions that will enable people to have a conversation? Framing is just a process of choosing powerful stories and words that people can relate to. And this is actually a really powerful conflict management technique because it helps us to do our work in a place that claims our common values rather than establishing dissent to start before we've even started the conversation. So one of the things that we'll be talking about in that next webinar in May will be how do we choose the words that are effective based on the stories that we hear in our congregation. How do we choose words that are particular to our context, but also some particular frames and foci that we have experienced over the years that have been very helpful in a number of churches.
Wonderful. So you can hear that it will be a very full 90 minutes on the next webinar. And again, want to remind you that if you want to talk about your process, talk about what has worked, what hasn't worked, the outcome of your of the assessment that you do within your community, Audrey and I are always available to help. And so please do call the RMN office at 773-736-5526, or you can email me at rachel@rmnetwork.org. If you have a question specifically for Audrey, her email address is audrey@rmnetwork.org as well. And lastly, we just want to thank you for participating on our webinar today. And as you exit the webinar, there is a survey, and so we do encourage you to share your thoughts, share any questions that you have lingering, or suggestions that you have for future webinars on that survey as you exit. So thank you very much for joining us tonight.